Hey everyone, welcome back to Mind the Gap. It's so nice to have you with us again. You know, Jen, I've been thinking about something lately. The more I study English, the more unfair it feels. Like, why are there so many rules and then just as many exceptions? Sometimes I honestly feel like English is just trolling me.
Oh, I get that, totally. People spend years trying to decode English as if it were a perfectly designed system, but it isn't, not at all. If you ever feel like English makes no sense, whether it's spelling, grammar, or idioms, that's actually perfectly reasonable, because English was never invented. It grew. It's more like an old city that kept expanding without any proper urban planning. Streets overlap, buildings clash, but somehow it works.
That's such a good image. So you mean English wasn't really built on purpose? Like it just happened?
Exactly. Imagine walking through London. You'll see a Roman wall next to a Victorian townhouse, and right behind that, a shiny glass tower. That's what English is like, a patchwork city made of different eras and cultures. Every invasion, every trade route, every power shift left a footprint on the language. So if it feels messy, that's because it is, but it's the kind of mess that tells a story.
So the chaos is part of its DNA. That actually explains a lot.
You've nailed it. Let's rewind a bit. Before English was English, Britain was home to Celtic tribes. Then came the Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They brought their own dialects, which blended together to form Old English. But if you saw Old English written down now, you'd probably think it's from another planet. Then, around the 8th to 11th century, the Vikings arrived. They didn't just raid and leave, they stayed, married locals, had kids. Their language mixed in too. That's why we have everyday words from Norse, like sky, egg, take, they. Simple, solid, still here.
Wait, they is from Norse? That's wild. I'd never guessed that.
Yeah, even the most ordinary words have travelled miles. But the biggest twist came in 1066, the Norman conquest. French suddenly became the language of the rulers, while ordinary people kept speaking Old English. So, for a few centuries, England was basically bilingual. You had one language for the castle and another for the kitchen.
No wonder English has double everything. That explains words like cow and beef, right?
Exactly. We say cow when it's in the field, but beef when it's served on the table. Pig and pork, sheep and mutton. It wasn't about vocabulary, it was about class. French was for the nobles, English was for the workers. So when you're choosing words today, you're unconsciously echoing that history. That's why English feels rich. It literally carries layers of society inside it.
Messy but beautiful. I like that. So when we say English is inconsistent, maybe it's just being honest about its past.
That's a lovely way to put it. English carries its history in every word, and maybe that's why it feels alive. It's not perfect, but it's real. So the next time you think English is weird, maybe it's just being itself.
That actually makes me feel better, because now when I mix things up, I can just say, hey, I'm keeping the tradition alive.
Exactly. You're just carrying on history, and that's the point. We can't really fix English. We can only understand how it became what it is. Once you see that, you stop fighting it and start flowing with it.
That's such a refreshing thought. It's not me against English, it's me walking with it.
That's spot on, and that's where everything starts. Understanding how English grew up is the first step to speaking it naturally.
You know, what you said earlier about English being this mix of history made me think of something. Every time I try to pick the right word, there's always another one that sounds almost the same but not quite. Like ask, request, inquire. They all mean to ask, but the feeling changes. Sometimes I say request, and people give me that polite, oh, interesting choice look.
Oh yes, the interesting choice face. Every learner knows that one.
But actually, that difference isn't random. It's one of the clearest marks left by English history. After the Norman conquest, French became the fancy language of the upper class, while Old English stayed with the common people. So two versions of the same word started to exist.
So that's why there's always the simple word and the fancy one.
Exactly, and they both survived. One stayed practical and earthy, the other sounded refined and distant. You can still hear it today. Ask feels natural, request feels polite, inquire sounds official. None of them is wrong, they just live in different parts of society.
That actually explains so much, because sometimes I think, why do I have to learn 3 words for the same thing? But it's not about quantity, it's about context.
That's it. Each word still carries the personality of the people who used it. I like to think of them as characters. Ask is the builder with rolled up sleeves, request wears a blazer, and inquire probably works behind a desk with a cup of tea.
That image is perfect. So maybe the trick isn't about memorizing words, it's about understanding who they belong to.
Exactly. Once you know that, you stop memorizing and start feeling the language. That's also why English feels rich, because every word has a story, a class, even a personality behind it.
That makes me think of how in Chinese we rely more on tone, but in English the word itself carries the tone.
True, English builds tone through vocabulary rather than sound. You can sound kind, cold, or polite simply by changing one word. Help feels warm, assist sounds professional. Once you learn which neighborhood a word lives in, you'll never feel lost again.
I love that way of seeing it. So learning vocabulary isn't about stacking words, it's about learning how society used them.
That's spot on. Once you start noticing who says what, English stops being a list of words and starts feeling like a living conversation between centuries.
Actually, something clicked for me while we were talking about vocabulary just now. I realised that even when I pick the right word, my sentence can still sound strange. Not wrong, just hard to follow. I often start speaking English by setting the whole scene first. Time, place, background, feelings, everything. And halfway through the sentence, I suddenly panic because I've forgotten what my main verb was meant to be.
That's such a familiar moment. And the interesting thing is, that panic isn't about grammar at all. It's about information order. English listeners are trained to listen in a very specific way. They want to know very early on who is doing what. Once they've got that anchor, they're happy to wait for the details. If that anchor comes too late, the sentence starts to feel slippery.
That explains why I sometimes see people nodding politely, but I can tell they're working a bit too hard to keep up. It's like I'm asking them to hold too much information in their head before giving them the point.
Exactly. English sentences are often built for listening, not just reading. Think of it like opening a map. English tends to put the pin down first. This is the place, this is the action. After that, you zoom out or zoom in. Chinese, on the other hand, often works more like a guided tour. The speaker sets the atmosphere, the shared context, and trusts the listener to follow along.
That's such a clear comparison. And it also explains why time and place feels so strict in English. I remember struggling with addresses and dates, always wondering why the order felt so unnatural to me.
Because in English, those details are part of the locating system. Time and place aren't decoration, they help the listener place the event inside a structure. That's why prepositions matter so much. They're not there to sound fancy, they're there to tell you where something sits in relation to everything else.
So, when I keep starting with background, I'm basically delaying the map pin. No wonder it feels messy.
That's a good way to put it, and this is where many learners get stuck. They try to fix it by memorizing longer sentences, but that often makes things worse. What actually helps is practicing the skeleton first. Subject, verb, core action. Once that's solid, you can decorate it as much as you like.
That changes how I think about speaking practice. Instead of trying to sound impressive, I should probably focus on sounding clear first.
Absolutely. Clarity comes before elegance. When English starts to feel easier, it's often not because your grammar improved overnight, but because your information order shifted. is stopped translating scenes and started building structures. And once that shift happens, speaking feels less like live translation and more like assembling blocks.
Something about that skeleton first idea makes me feel seen, because the place I freeze is always the beginning of the sentence. It's like my brain opens a little menu with 10 possible openings, and I just sit there staring at it. I'm trying to be accurate, I'm trying to be polite, I'm trying not to sound weird, and then I say nothing. Meanwhile, the other person is just waiting calmly, like I'm buffering.
That buffering image is painfully accurate, and honestly, it's one of the most common stages of intermediate learners. Your ideas are fine, your Chinese is fluent. The problem is the conversion. When you switch into English, it can feel like you're converting a video file into a different format. The more you want it to be perfect, the longer the processing takes. And because you're doing that processing live in front of another human, it feels 10 times worse.
That's exactly it. The moment someone looks at me, my brain goes, right, produce English now. And then it's like my tongue has forgotten how to be a tongue.
And here's the key part. Native speakers aren't doing that conversion. They're not thinking in Chinese, then translating. They're using ready-made English starts. Not because they're smarter, but because the first few words are already sitting there, like a reflex. So they don't build sentences from scratch, they launch, then they steer.
Launch first, steer later. I like that, because my version is plan the whole route, check the map twice, then forget how to drive.
Exactly, and that's why your sentence beginnings feel scary. You're trying to decide everything before you speak, but speaking isn't writing. When we speak, we need something we can grab quickly. That's where English starters come in. Things like, I think, to be honest, it depends, the thing is. Those aren't fancy, they're practical. They buy you a second. They give your brain a runway.
That makes me think of another thing I struggle with. Even when I manage to speak, my English can come out a bit sharp. The meaning is correct, but the vibe feels off, especially with British people, because sometimes they sound so gentle, and I sound like I'm filing a complaint.
That's such a good observation. In British English, the softening isn't decoration, it's social spacing. We use little buffers to avoid sounding like we're cornering someone. So you'll hear phrases that sound longer than necessary, but they're doing a job. Would you mind? I was wondering is there any chance? If you only translate the meaning, you skip that cushioning, then your English can sound a bit blunt, even when you're trying to be friendly.
So it's not just that I'm translating words, I'm translating without the social padding. That's why it feels like my personality disappears in English.
That's it, and I want people listening to hear this clearly. Freezing isn't proof that you're bad at English. It's proof that you're doing too much work in real time. You're translating content, structure, and social tone all at once. No wonder the system crashes. So instead of blaming yourself, the goal is to reduce the load. Build a few reliable starts, build a few gentle buffers, and let them become automatic. Then you're not translating, you're responding.
Okay, that's the question then. How do we actually turn translation into reflex? Because I can understand it now, but I still want it to show up when I'm nervous.
Perfect. And that's exactly where we're going next, because the most practical tool for this is chunks. Not long sentences you memorize like a script, but small, flexible blocks you can reuse. Once you have those, you won't be staring at a menu of 10 openings anymore. You'll just start talking, and the rest will follow.
The menu of 10 openings thing you said is painfully real, because in my head it's not even 10, it's like a full-on buffet. And I'll stand there trying to pick the best option, and by the time I've chosen, the moment's gone. So when you say chunks, I get the idea, but I also feel a bit suspicious, because my brain goes, oh great, more things to memorize.
That suspicion is healthy. And no, this isn't about stuffing your head with more sentences. Think of it this way. Single words are like loose parts in a toolbox, useful but slow. Chunks are like small pre-built modules. When you speak, you don't have time to assemble everything from bolts and screws. You need something you can pick up and plug in. That's why native speakers sound quick. They aren't racing through grammar, they're reaching for ready shapes.
So it's not about sounding fancy, it's about saving seconds, like giving my brain a shortcut key.
Exactly. And it also keeps your tone stable. Because when you're translating word by word, your tone becomes accidental. You might sound too blunt or too dramatic without meaning to. But chunks often come with built-in tone. They carry a default social setting. And in British English, that matters because we use tone and softening to keep things smooth. Not to be fake, just to avoid stepping on toes.
Okay, can we make this concrete? Because I think listeners will want a real-life scene. Let's say I'm at work and I want to ask a colleague for help. My direct translation version would be something like, "Can you help me? I need you to do this." Which is not rude in Chinese, but in English it can sound a bit like I'm giving orders.
That's a brilliant example because the meaning is fine, but the landing is a bit heavy. In English, especially in British workplaces, you often soften the entry. You might say, "Could you give me a hand with this?" Or, "Would you mind having a quick look?" Notice what those chunks do. They make it sound like a request, not a command. And they also give the other person an easy way to say yes or no without awkwardness.
Right, it's like I'm not pushing the door open, I'm knocking first. What about refusing an invitation? Because that's another place where my English turns into a robot. Someone says, "Do you want to come?" And I say, "No, I can't." End of story.
The classic hard stop. Again, not wrong, just abrupt. This is where chunks help because they give you a soft edge. Something like, "I'd love to, but I've got something on." Or, "That sounds lovely, but I'm not going to make it this time." Those are small patterns. You can swap the details, but the tone stays friendly. And that friendliness is cultural as well. It shows you value the invitation even when the answer is no.
So chunks are doing two jobs at once. They make me faster and they make me socially accurate. That's such a different goal from memorize more vocabulary.
Exactly, and I'd keep it simple for practice. Don't collect 50, pick a few that you genuinely would use. A couple for giving opinions, a couple for turning the conversation, a couple for soft requests. Then repeat them until they stop feeling like phrases and start feeling like buttons you can press without thinking. That's when English begins to sound like conversation, not an exam answer.
I think that's the biggest shift. We're not practicing English sentences, we're practicing a way of interacting. And once that's in place, the words come out with the right temperature.
That's beautifully said, because language isn't just information, it's relationship. So yes, chunks are a shortcut, but they're also a bridge. And in the next part, we'll zoom out one last time and talk about what happens when you start thinking in those patterns. That's when the whole English mindset idea becomes real.
Listening to all this, I feel strangely calmer. Not because English suddenly became easy, but because it finally feels explainable, like it's not attacking me personally.
That's a good place to land, because once a language feels explainable, you stop fighting it. And today, everything we talked about is actually connected. The mixed history led to layered vocabulary. Those layers shaped how people choose words. That, in turn, shaped how information is ordered. And all of it shows up when real people talk to each other.
So when English feels awkward, it's often not because I'm wrong, it's because I'm using the wrong defaults.
Exactly. You're bringing Chinese defaults into English conversations. That's natural. But English tends to want the skeleton first, the tone softened, and the intention made clear early. Once you borrow those defaults, even briefly, things start to flow.
I like that you said borrow, because it doesn't feel like I have to change who I am.
You don't. You're not becoming British. You're just switching operating systems for a moment. Same ideas, same personality, different order and tone. And that's enough to make a big difference.
So learning English well isn't about translating better, it's about letting English think first.
That's a lovely way to put it. Once English gets to go first, speaking stops feeling like a test and starts feeling like a conversation.
If you've been listening and nodding along, thinking, that's me, I always get stuck in my head, then this episode was for you.
If it helped even a little, remember to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's still stuck translating in their head. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening. Bye!